What's going on, Badger fans? We need to ask some questions about this basketball team. Talk about it a little bit. How shook are we? Is this just noise in a long season, or is this the start of a potential slide? Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers. Thank you for making this your first listen every single day. Really, really do appreciate it. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. All right, let's talk about it. So I'm always excited to bring on people who I find really sharp and whose opinions I think make us all smarter. That's definitely Kedrick Stumbris. Scotty Six Pack Podcast, great content dropping over there all the time. Badger Notes, he's all over the map and does great stuff. Kedrick, I was actually going to have you on. We were going to do this before the Michigan game and talk about how shook are we. And then I think fortuitously we had to reschedule it, and I think these storylines are even more apt now. I just want to start there, man. Three-game losing streak coming off that incredible Michigan State game. We dropped 3 in a row. How shook are you right now?
So I think the shook factor has to relay back to this general general feeling that certain college basketball teams fall into during the season, that at certain times you're going to take losses that you shouldn't, right? Wisconsin took a loss at Nebraska that it shouldn't have. Unfortunately, Wisconsin took that loss right before it played a game that it should have lost then, right? You don't want to play games where you should win, but you do lose, and then play games right after where you are supposed to lose. Wisconsin had the unfortunate circumstance of having that sequence in playing at Nebraska and losing, and then playing home against Purdue. And now you stack on that additional Michigan loss. It just makes things look worse than it necessarily should. You sometimes have these weird losses in the college basketball season. If they come at odd times, it makes things worse than they necessarily look. I'm not feeling that bad about this Wisconsin basketball season right now, but the sequencing of everything makes things look pretty rough at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point that I haven't seen a lot. It really is that sequencing. And I would argue, you kind of mentioned that Nebraska game is the game we should have won. I would even argue that it's really just the way we lost it that has kind of tipped the red flag, right? Because I actually kind of thought we would lose that game going into it. Nebraska's tough at home. It just felt like
That's
a game
fair.
we dropped. And if we had just dropped that in a normal sense, like we didn't have a lights out first half and they didn't have a lights out second half. So I'm actually not that shook either, because I look at it as 2 losses that I can understand and then 1 bad loss. Listen, the Michigan game's a bad loss. A bad loss happens to every team in college basketball just about every year. So yeah. I'm not that shook either, surprisingly.
Yeah, I think that the one thing fans of this Wisconsin Badgers team have to remember, right, is one of the best things. Look, I'm a real college basketball sicko. I have a University of Texas Rio Grande Valley hat on right now, right? Not out of trying to make a point by any means, like out of I love college basketball as a whole hog. I got a Western Athletic Conference team hat on right now because I love college basketball as a whole. In the sport, one of the best things about it is that teams can kind of lose to almost any team 1 through 362 at any time during the year. You don't want to lose to any team 1 through 362, but it can happen. So taking a quote unquote bad loss to a quad 2 team on the road, Nebraska, Michigan, feels really rough. It can, derail the season in the sense that, unfortunately, this Wisconsin team doesn't have the chance to win the Big Ten regular season title that I think we would have really all loved to see it win earlier this year, but has most everything else in front of it. And if you take out that Big Ten regular season title from the rest of it, it's just a weird college basketball loss that you expect from pretty much any team any single year.
Now, let's ask this then. So I think you and I are kind of we're at least in the same book on this one. Maybe not the exact same page, but we're on the same book. But I do think there's probably some questions that have either been in our head or have come up in this 3-game skid too, right? That I think are legitimate reasons that I don't really like. I'm mostly okay with this, but that seems kind of off. I want to start with Stephen Crowl. I know that's something you talked about on your podcast, your show. Listen, you're on a 5-game sample size here where he scored more than 10 points the last 5 games one time. And included in that mix is 4 out of those 5 games where he has had 7 rebounds or less, right? Like, so you're on kind of a stretch here. It's not just like if he played bad against Zach Edey in Purdue, which that was a tough game with foul trouble. Like, you're okay. It's Zach Edey. It's Purdue. This is kind of starting to become a thing. And that's a problem because we talked about going into the season. What's the biggest problem on this team? It's depth behind Stephen Crowl. So if he's not playing well, he's getting in foul trouble. I don't have a great answer for it. I do want to put this comment up, and we're going to get into comments, and I want to see what you're thinking here. This is from Wayne Meyer. Talking a little bit about some of the touches Crowell's getting, where he's 6, 7, 8 feet behind, like out in the paint. That's tough for Stephen Crowl to dribble down 4 or 5 seconds, and when you know he's going to get doubled, and he's not the quickest passer out of that. Do you see a path here to get Crowl back on track, or what do you see as the biggest issue here?
I think Stephen Crowl has had to play, a tough game against Purdue where he's going to be outmatched against Zach Edey. If you add in the fact that he had a rough game against Nebraska beforehand, and then a game where he got in foul trouble really early against Michigan into it, you have some Stephen Crowl games that just come at an unfortunate time from a matchup standpoint, and then to a situational standpoint on top of it. Stephen Crowl has always kind of struggled against these more stout centers, these more muscular centers. And I think that Michigan's Terrace Reed really, really do come into that mold more than almost anybody else. I think the unfortunate part is that Rutgers Christian Amori coming up this Saturday kind of fits that mold better than maybe anybody else in the Big Ten outside of Zach Edey does. But Stephen Crowl, who had, 4 fouls against Purdue, 2 of them, which I think the point I go back to again and again is that 2 of the 4 fouls that Stephen Crowl had against Purdue were not committed against Zach Edey. I would have much preferred if he was going to have 4 fouls, foul himself, out of the game a little bit early. All 4 of those being against Zach Edey would have been a much preferable situation rather than 2 against Zach Edey, 2 against Fletcher Lawyer. Would have been better. And then, 2 against, 4 in the Michigan game, getting his third with 17 and a half minutes against left into the second half, more than 11 and a half minutes left in regulation for his 4th foul against Michigan, kind of left the Wisconsin front court in a tough situation where they have some depth of the wing with Connor Esigian, with John Blackwell, but at the front court, they don't have a ton outside of a true freshman in Nolan Winter. If Stephen Crowl is going to be fouling himself out early by taking a large volume of fouls earlier on in the game, that's going to put this Wisconsin team at a disadvantage. I pointed out on my show, like you kind of said, Stephen Crowl has played 19 minutes in the game against Michigan. He had only played that 19-minute mark or fewer in 2 games since December 19th, since December 8th of 2021. Wisconsin likes to play through the paint. They like to play through Stephen Crowl. They like to play through Tyler Wall. And if Crowl is fouling himself early and getting himself into foul trouble early, it's going to create real problems for this team. And if Crowl can't get himself on track against this really stout Rutgers defense on Saturday, it's going to present real problems for this Badgers team.
The augmenting factor here is, to me, the type of people that get Stephen Crowl in foul trouble are also the type of people Nolan Winter can't handle right now either.
Yeah.
So, your backup that comes in is going to be in the same type of pickle. We saw that against Michigan. Like, Winter had moments where he physically it's not even his fault, man. He's just not ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely not. It's not. And it is just the fact that Wisconsin is lining up these tall, but not necessarily stout, not necessarily extra muscular centers that these Badgers forwards aren't built to deal with right now. I think about the putback dunk Zach Edey had over Nolan Winter on Sunday. I think about the kind of head fake, then turnaround dunk by Terrace Reed on Wednesday against Michigan that really fooled Nolan Winter. Those are hard enough to deal with just from a youth standpoint. It's even harder to deal with when those guys got 20, 30 pounds on you. It's a tough situation in college basketball when the type of athlete, when the physical composure of the athletes you're going up against just differ so much on a week to week, game to game basis.
Yep, 100% agree. All right, we got to take a quick break. We're going to come back with Kedrick. I want to talk about John Blackwell. I want to talk about the bench. I want to talk about AJ Storr. I also want to see if there's anything else from these last 3 games that have kind of popped up in your mind. Talk about Stephen Crowl. Anything else that you're like, not really sure about that. We're going to do that next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for our friends of the show over on FanDuel. FanDuel remains the number one source for all your sports needs and information. Everything you need for any type of sports book. That's where we go. We go FanDuel.com/lockedon. New customers get a great offer. $5 bet, win or lose, you get $150 back in bonus bets. Use that. Do it responsibly. I always say that. Please do it responsibly, but have fun with it. Enjoy it. Use that to get some Badger swag. Put some money on the Badgers-Rutgers game coming up, or the Super Bowl, or NBA, whatever it is. Listen, Bucks picking up Patrick Beverly. I think that's kind of a nice addition. Perimeter defense, a little toughness, a little bit of an edge. Now, I don't like the dude, but he's the type of guy you kind of like him if he's on your team, right? That is absolutely that guy. So if you want to put something on the NBA, the Bucks, certainly FanDuel is a great place to do it. Easy to use, simple. The payouts are fast. FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon for our offer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of the NFL. All right, let's get Kedrick back on here. Kedrick, I do want to start here, man. Where can people find your work? I know show, Badger Notes, everything going on in your life. Where can people follow you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. You can follow me on the website, formerly known as Twitter, at Kedrick Stumbris, spelled how it sounds. I host a 6-day-a-week podcast, Scotty 6-pack, and of course at Badger Notes, where I know you've had several of our staff writers on the show. Badger Notes doing great work. Dylan Graff, the commander in chief over there, doing excellent work, keeping us up on all things Badgers all the time.
Absolutely. Great talent over there. And I always try to get if I could have you guys on every day, I would. I don't want to be the neighbor that's always knocking and asking for like sugar, which sometimes I want to go here, man. Well, actually, I want to kick it over to you. So I talked about Crowell's, like one of the big things that's sticking out to me that I'm a little worried about legitimately. Anything else from this, specifically this recent slide where you're looking at it and you're like, I don't like how that looks?
Oof. I think foul trouble has to be the biggest one, right? That I think of, because I think that's one of the biggest ways that he's been kept out of the game over the last 3. Of course, that note that he and Tyler Wall combined for 7 shots from the field in the game against Nebraska is concerning. But if you look at the way Tyler Wall responded in the game against Purdue, I think Tyler Wall kind of took that performance to heart and responded in one of the games that I think of as, frankly, in a loss, one of Tyler Wall's best performances in his career against Purdue. Yeah. He played really, really well. I mean, like 6 offensive rebounds in a game where you're going up against Zach Edey, I think says all you need to know about Tyler Wall's performance in that game. He played pretty solid in that game against Michigan as well, but Stephen Crowl, in the meantime, has gotten into real foul trouble in both of those games, and has presented a real issue for Wisconsin trying to keep up in the meanwhile. That I think is the biggest question for Stephen Crowl there. Obviously, he didn't have the greatest offensive game against Nebraska, didn't have the greatest offensive game against Michigan, but did okay in Purdue in his limited minutes. But he's having his minutes limited by his inability to stay on the floor. If he can stay on the floor, I think this Wisconsin team stands a much better chance in these games against tough Big Ten competition.
So I have a bunch of things I want to talk to, but I want to kick it to you. What's another storyline here with this Badger team coming off this 3-game kind of slide that is really interesting to you?
Ooh, I think one of the most interesting things is the Chucky Hepburn of it all, right? He's having his worst 3-point shooting season of his career, but had an okay night on Wednesday against Michigan. He got up double-digit shots from the floor. That was only the second time since November that he's gotten up double-digit shots from the floor this season, which says a lot about his adaptation to the role as a facilitator first player versus a score first player, but is saying maybe he's finding a path to meeting the middle ground between those two roles. It really looked like in his game against Michigan that he was going into that game with a mission of creating some shots for himself. He had like this really great and one drive to the basket that I think about in that game against Michigan that I think said a lot about his ability to score in that game. Most of the buckets that he got in this game were off of driving to the basket himself, which I think will create more opportunities for other players on the floor in that game. I think that's one of the biggest things I think about off of this 3-game losing streak is you had a Chucky Hepburn who was not taking a lot of shots earlier in the season, was not taking a lot of shots against Purdue in particular, but then comes out of this game against Michigan, taking many more shots, looking a lot better. And then the second storyline that I think about is AJ Storr. I asked Greg Gard in a post-game presser back in December about AJ Storr's shot selection. And Greg Gard's answer to that, was a little long-winded, but the very first sentence out of his mouth was, AJ Storr is learning what a good shot is. I think he's maybe still trying to learn. And I think with AJ Storr, you take a little bit of good with the bad. Of course, he shot something like 7 of 14 in that Michigan game for 20 points. And I think you kind of take that, right? There is something that this Wisconsin team was missing last season in a core that is mostly the same that it has this season, but was missing an AJ Storr who was unafraid to go out and put the ball to the hoop. Now that Wisconsin has that this season, I think it is unfair maybe to criticize every bad shot that AJ Storr takes, but he needs to take better shots, maybe reduce 2 or 3 of the bad shots that he takes per game. But some of these bad shots, I think you kind of have to take with the chance that he makes some of the bad shots. And if he's going to do, some of that from time to time, it is something that this Wisconsin basketball team is going to be better for. And Wisconsin, despite their poor performance in some aspects in the second half against Michigan, they had scored Michigan by 16 points in the paint in the second half. Mm-hmm. They gave up some of the paint in the first half by dribble penetration in particular against Michigan, but really cleaned that up in the second half. So if AJ Storr is going to be willing to go to the rack and maybe you have to settle for some of these mid-range jump shots that he likes to take, I think you kind of just have to take those with the tough shots that he's going to make alongside these tough shots that he's going to miss. And I think you combine those two things together with the Chucky Hepburn maybe coming into his own here with the AJ Storr. You kind of just take the good with the bad of, I think that might just be the AJ Storr experience. I think that maybe tells us more of the story of the Wisconsin basketball season this year than I think just a poor 3-game skid that Stephen Crowl has had these past 3 games that I think have kind of come through unlucky, foul trouble circumstances.
Yeah, I like the phrase you used, the AJ Storr experience, because I bought a ticket on that, and I'm pretty happy about it still. I love the AJ Storr talk. I think we could do a whole show on AJ Storr because
Oh yeah.
I look at the last 3 games, right? And he shot 50% against Nebraska, 11 of 22. Then he had a really poor game against Purdue. He's 4-15, and then 7 of 14 against Michigan, right? And you look at a guy, if you pull those numbers apart a little bit, you look at a guy who shot 50% in 2 Big Ten road games in this streak, like on volume, right? Like,
yeah, 14 shots is a lot of volume.
Yeah. Like 22 is a ton of shots. People don't do that. People don't go on the road in the Big Ten and put 2 road games back to back. Like, and yet it's almost like if you just box score watched, you'd think in your head, Badger fans would think, oh, this guy is a lottery pick. And then when you see the discourse of people seeing him, they're like, gosh, I don't know. I honestly think there's far more good than bad with Storr. I think the bad shots stick out because they're kind of really obvious. Like that last turnover against Michigan sticks out because it's really obvious. But then you go back to the box score and you see a guy, he got to the free throw line 5-6 times. He's putting pressure on the rim, right? He only had 3 turnovers against Michigan, scored 20 points. Like, you're not in the game without AJ Storr. You're not in the game against Nebraska without AJ Storr. So I agree with your bigger point of I think you take the good with the bad, and I think the good outweighs the bad. And the other point I'd make with Storr, he's kind of to some degree, like I don't want to make excuses for him, but he's a sophomore wing scorer.
Yeah.
What do people expect when you pass them the ball in the wing, right? Like,
yeah.
So I think there's more of, if you don't want him getting 22 shots, well, then the other pieces need to shoot more and do a little bit more offensively so he doesn't have to get 22 shots.
Yeah, I think that you made an excellent point earlier this week on your show, which is maybe AJ Storr didn't have the best coaching his freshman year at St. John's, right? Where Greg Gard, for as long as the season has gone on, right, he has said when answering questions about AJ Storr that he treats some of these transfers in as freshmen in his program. He said the same about Kamari McGee for as long as he has been in the program. And I think it is interesting and notable that Greg Gard has had the same point about Kamari McGee, who is coming from the Horizon League and UW Green Bay, and the same answer about AJ Storr, who is coming from the Big East and St. John's. I think that says a lot about maybe the quality of coaching that AJ Storr had for 1 year at St. John's, where that coach is no longer there, where now AJ Storr is getting more of an opportunity to learn behind a Greg Gard, a veteran-led Wisconsin Badgers basketball team, about, getting good shots up, about playing solid defense, that allows him to really develop into the player that he could be, which is, frankly, when you really look at AJ Storr and how he plays across a full 40 minutes, potentially an NBA player. So I think there's a lot of AJ Storr to be unlocked. So that's exactly why I think you take the good with the bad with him. And is why I think it is totally fair to view him as a high variance player in this offense that is one of the most efficient in college basketball this season.
Yeah, that's well said. For one of the most efficient offenses in college basketball, your high volume score has to be pretty good, right? Yeah. You're not going to have the offense you have if that's not the case. All right, we're going to take one more quick break, come back, talk about the bench, John Blackwell, and then take a couple of your comments. I'm going to keep Kedrick as long as I can possibly keep him. We'll see how late we can go on this one. But thank you so much for tuning in. Really do appreciate it. Again, always thank you so much for helping us build this amazing community. The Badger community is incredible, and I really do appreciate it. So thank you so much for tuning in, just everything you guys do. All right. I want to come back, Kedrick, and just talk about the bench. Kamari McGee got hurt. It feels like that's such a weird one too, because it feels like that's a bigger deal than it should be. It is kind of how it shouldn't have thrown this off that much, in my opinion, but it feels like it has.
So I think Kamari McGee has been one of the unsung heroes of this team. I'm looking over outside of my camera, because if you look at Chucky Hepburn's minutes in the game against Nebraska, Chucky Hepburn played 41 minutes against Nebraska. And he typically plays, something like a 38, 37 minute mark. And 41 minutes then when you have something like an extra 5 minutes of game time. He's basically playing the same amount of minutes that he would play in a 40-minute game, but then adding the 5 extra minutes onto his mark in this overtime game against Nebraska. I think a lot of this is a downstream effect of not having Kamari McGee in the lineup, right? You can't necessarily trust a former walk-on in Isaac Lindsey, who has shown some propensity to play at the point in times during this season and past seasons. Wisconsin has shown kind of an unwillingness to put Connor Essegian in some of these lineups from time to time, which I think you can say is good or say is bad. I think it kind of depends on your personal preference. I don't think Connor Essegian had the best outing against Michigan, for example. He was minus 11 in that game, but maybe you want Connor Essegian to get more minutes across the season to give him more of a chance to play a little bit better and give Max Klesmit the ability to play better minutes at the lead guard position. I really do think that the Kamari McGee injury is having more downstream effects this season for Wisconsin basketball than most, non-Wisconsin fans would tend to think that it is otherwise having. It is one of those unsung heroes of the team where he's not putting up a ton of points, not a ton of minutes, but the ability for him to come in and play in real solid defensive minutes is not something that I think that anybody else has the ability to come in and replicate off of the bench at the lead guard position for Wisconsin this season.
No, he gives you defensive quickness. I've been very impressed with McGee. But here's where I push back a little bit. And again, I preface this with I'm not in practices, obviously. I don't know the inner workings of the team. I'm not smarter than Greg Gard, but to me, and I want to say this without being any type, but Kamari McGee can't be the reason to me Chucky Hepburn plays 41 minutes. And I don't know if that's a stubbornness thing. This is where I struggle because I'm not in practices. Maybe there's a reason for this, and I'm sure there is, but I have a hard time believing you can't slide Klesmit over to the one, play Connor a little bit more, play Blackwell a little bit more, and buy a few more minutes for Chucky Hepburn. And I don't think that's realistic, but
the only pushback I would have on that is look at the Michigan game. Connor Essegian was minus 11 in that game. I think about a sequence where Essegian was protecting the perimeter on Namari Burnett and left Burnett to go double team a player along with Tyler Wall.
I remember the sequence.
Yes. The player beats out the double team, kicks the ball back up to Namari Burnett, and Burnett buries an open three.
Yep.
You go to the other side of the floor in this same sequence, 30 seconds later, and Connor Essegian turns the ball over trying to get it to the baseline on Jump Blackwell. There is something to be said for as fun as it is to watch Connor Essegian play. He's not an excellently polished player and still has his downfalls. And that's why he finished that game against Michigan with a minus 11 plus minus. And I think that we can say this Wisconsin basketball team is not, struggling just because Kamari McGee is out of the lineup. There are certainly other reasons, right? We've talked about Stephen Crowl for a long portion of the show and his maybe underperformance as a big reason for that too. But I think it is something to be said for the overall maybe dissatisfaction we have with the depth at the lead guard position that has been exposed by a Kamari McGee injury overall that has led to this spot where we are left with some, questionable minutes in the backcourt for Wisconsin.
Well, the two things I would add to that, and listen, that's a very good point. I remember that sequence. Connor is still going to have issues defensively. He's never going to be the guy that Hepburn, Klesmit, those players are, or that Kamari McGee is, quite frankly, to our point. To me, it could also be a Klesmit, Blackwell, Storr, Wall lineup. I think there's options there, I guess is what I'm saying. But I do hear you. I think sometimes Connor fans are so eager to see him shoot that they don't see at times some of the breakdowns, some of the issues. My
Mhm.
question with you on Connor, I was having this thought the other game. It does feel like at times he's in a bit of a no-win situation. And listen, some of that's on him, right? Got hurt early in the year. Defense hasn't been good enough. But it also feels like as soon as he's out there, he knows he has to shoot almost some of those
Mm.
three takes are tough. Those are not easy shots, but I feel like he has to shoot those because he knows that's his sliver of time. And I think that's difficult. That's a lot to put on a sophomore.
I do totally agree with you, right? Because in the Purdue game, he was 0-4 from 3. In the Michigan game, he was 0-2 from 3. So
Mhm.
over the course of the last 2 games, he's 0-6. And coming into those last 2 games, I would have said, let's get Connor Essegian more run in the second half. Because when he does get into the game, he is usually coming in for a set play where the shot is going to him and he typically buries it. Buries it in the case where he has a tough shot with the defender right in his face and is still able to do it. Um, but as I think the situation has become more clear with him, where he's coming in for an ATO or in last season, for example, and Greg Gard has said in pressers this season, right, where the film is out on him. They know that he's going to go and shoot the 3, which means that there are going to be defenders more ready to defend him on the perimeter,
Mhm.
and that has led to tougher situations for him, and it has led to the good with the bad. Um, I think maybe unfortunately these last uh, over the course of the past second half of last season and then through this season, the situation just hasn't fared well for him. Where I think that he could be a really, really, really solid piece if he weren't faced with the position of having to be the go-to off the bench starter all the time for this team, for example. And maybe John Blackwell also is that, but you put that into perspective of a young kid who doesn't necessarily have the built-in body mass to drive to the hoop. I think he has some of that in his game, but if he doesn't have that inherently in his game, it is a much harder position for him to be in when defenders know to key in on him in the perimeter.
Yeah, and I think it's been very hard for him to find that rhythm, right? And a lot of that people point that at Guard. It's a lot of it's not on Guard. He was hurt to start the year, like he got banged up right away, and then
Yeah,
the struggles, and then
right
it
away.
all emerged. Like there's been a lot of other factors here, but you can tell like it just hasn't fully clicked in him, and that stinks because he could be a major weapon for really any team if he had that rhythm and they found that right role. I want to finish here, and I've already kept you for. I try to keep you about 30 minutes. I already kept you longer than I'm supposed to. But I do want to finish you here with a comment I thought I had on Hepburn, and I'm curious what you think on this going forward. To me, it feels like Hepburn is almost predetermining a little bit. Like there were some shots in the Michigan game
Mm,
where he drove in and it's a tough baseline, kind of mid range, and he took it. It's like a fadeaway, and it felt like like a quarterback taking his first read, right?
mhm.
It feels like he hasn't found, for whatever reason, he's lost his rhythm a little bit, and instead of reading the game, which he can definitely do, he's a great point guard. It feels like he's come up the court almost predetermining. I'm going to shoot it or I'm going to pass it. I'm curious if you see any of that with him.
Well, Ryan, always happy to be here with you as long as you'll keep me. But I do see some of that with Chucky Hepburn, but I also don't hate it, right? I think at a certain point you need a point guard to say, one of these possessions, I'm going to take the ball to the hoop. And I think one of the criticisms you have there of being like, all right, I'm going to take a fadeaway here if I'm Chucky Hepburn, um, isn't the best. But I think at certain points in time, you need to threaten of, I'm just going to keep the ball no matter what happens. If I have a double team closing in on me, I'm going to go and get as close to the rim as I possibly can. I think is something dangerous for a point guard to have in his bag and say to the defense that I'm going to take it as close to the rim as I can and threaten the defense to saying, all right, you need to either collapse in on me or leave a defender leave a defender off of the wing for me to kick it out to, right? And leave that kind of ambiguous for the point guard to make that play to. So I think that Chucky Hepburn did against Michigan leave maybe some of that on the table for him to kick out to other shooters, but it was one of the first games that I think we've seen all season that Chucky Hepburn has really, really, really dedicated himself to saying, I'm going to go and try to create for myself. And we're going to need a game in there for Chucky Hepburn to say, I'm going to go and create some for myself, for him to find that sweet spot of creating for himself or creating for others, for him to find exactly what that sweet spot is, for me to come back to my own comments there. Because if he isn't able to explore that side of shooting himself, taking the ball for himself, he's not going to be able to find exactly what it is there. And I think fortunately for this Wisconsin team, they have some wiggle room where they're comfortably in the NCAA tournament. I think right now they're comfortably at a top 4 seed. Unless they take, a couple of other really unexpected losses. So Chucky Hepburn has a little bit more free roam to go ahead and to find that space for himself. And if he's able to find that sweet spot, I think this Wisconsin basketball team is going to be really dangerous come March.
Yeah, and for the record, I love aggressive Chucky. I just need it to get to the point where it's aggressive Chucky, but we're also creating for others, because there's a dearth of that on this team. There's not a lot of people that can create for others outside of maybe Wall. Maybe Wall's your second. Klesmit? I don't know.
I think Stephen Crowl is really good at that too, right?
That's
Like
fair.
he's really good at playing off of the double team. And I think an aggressive Chucky is, for as much as we've talked about this season, right? We, as the general Wisconsin Badgers commentariat, have talked about Chucky Hepburn being an excellent shot creator for other people. The times which Chucky Hepburn is the best shot creator is when he is being aggressive himself. Because when he is aggressive himself, it allows defenders to collapse on him and lead to other shots that would not otherwise be open without an aggressive Chucky Hepburn. So I think a Stephen Crowl was also an aggressive shot creator. I think a lot of the players on this team are shot creators for the other members of this Wisconsin basketball team. And if Chucky Hepburn is able to be more aggressive, like I said earlier, he has only had one other game this season outside of Nebraska and Michigan where he has put up double-digit shot attempts. If he is able to put up, or even threaten double-digit shot attempts in Big Ten games going forward, it's going to put another layer to this Wisconsin offense, which is already top 10 in adjusted efficiency, according to Ken Pom, that I think could really, really make this Wisconsin team a threat in the Big Ten tournament in the first and even second weekends of March.
I love it, man. As always, Kedrick Stumbris making us smarter. Really do appreciate the perspective, man. Definitely go check out his work. We got his Twitter account right here. Talked about the podcast, Scotty Six Pack. So definitely go check out what he's doing. Also on Badger Notes. Thank you so much, man. I do appreciate it as always. On Wisconsin.